The silence of his small, cluttered study was a physical weight, pressing down on John's shoulders as he stared at the digital recorder on his desk. Its small red light was unblinking, an unfeeling eye waiting for a confession he had sworn never to make. His hands, once steady enough to calibrate the sensitive ionics of an F-16, now trembled with a fine, constant tremor. He could still feel the ghost of Ohio's humid summer air, the specific scent of jet fuel and ozone that had clung to his uniform for years. That was 1987, a lifetime ago. Yet the memory was as sharp and invasive as a shard of glass, buried deep and festering for 36 years. He was just a kid then, a proud Air Force mechanic stationed at Wright, Patterson, believing in the mission, in the flag, in the straightforward nature of duty. He had loved the rhythmic roar of engines, the intricate puzzle of wiring and hydraulics, the camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives, thousands of feet in the air. It had all been so clean, so ordered, until it wasn't, until the orders changed, and the whispers started, and the entire foundation of his reality was quietly, systematically dismantled behind the massive, locked doors of Hangar 18. For decades, he had carried the truth like a leaden secret in his chest, a corrosive burden that had cost him sleep, peace, and the easy trust that once defined him. He had become a man who jumped at shadows, who avoided conversations about space or government, whose eyes would unconsciously drift toward the night sky with a mixture of dread and a terrible aching wonder. The official forms he had signed, thick stacks of paper threatening him with prison or worse, had been effective prison bars of their own, caging his story inside him. But time, he had learned, was a relentless force. It had eroded his youth, but it had also worn down the sharp edges of his fear, leaving behind the dull, heavy ache of a truth that demanded to be spoken. The world had moved on, blissfully ignorant, while he remained trapped in that single pivotal moment in 1987, replaying the sights and sounds that had rewired his understanding of existence itself. He could no longer live with the ghost of Hangar 18, haunting his every quiet moment. The weight of decades of silence was now greater than the fear of the consequences. He drew a shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and resolve. His finger hovered over the recorder's button. It was time to break the silence. It was time to confess what he had seen. The Ohio sun beat down on the tarmac, baking the concrete and making the distant horizon shimmer like a mirage. For John, stepping onto Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for the first time in the summer of 1987 felt like walking into the heart of his own personal legend. The air itself vibrated with purpose, a constant, low-frequency hum composed of distant engine whines, shouted commands, and the pervasive, sharp scent of aviation fuel. He was 22, his uniform crisp, his back straight, and his heart swelling with a pride so profound it felt like a physical force. This was it, the culmination of training, discipline, and a boyhood dream to be part of something larger than himself. He was assigned to the 88th Maintenance Squadron, and the sprawling complex of hangars and workshops felt like a cathedral dedicated to human ingenuity. Giant C-130 Hercules transport planes sat like patient beasts, their propellers silent but promising immense power, while the sleeker, predatory forms of F-16 Falcons were tended to by crews of focused mechanics. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Everywhere he looked, there was coordinated motion, a symphony of labor where every individual was a vital note. He reported to a hangar that smelled of grease, sweat, and ozone, the very aroma of duty. His new sergeant, a man named Miller with a face like worn leather and eyes that missed nothing, gave him a brief, appraising look before assigning him to a team. There was Rodriguez, whose hands moved with an artist's precision over engine components. Davies, a lanky Texan, with a dry wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of hydraulic systems, and Kowalski, a bear of a man whose booming laugh could be heard over the roar of a turbine. They were his new tribe. The initial handshakes were firm, the nods respectful, and within hours, the easy rhythm of shared work began to weave the threads of camaraderie. They showed him the routines, the unspoken rules of the hangar floor, the specific way to log inspections, and the sacred ritual of the mid-morning coffee break. That first evening, sitting in the bustling mess hall, surrounded by the cacophony of clattering trays and overlapping conversations, John felt a profound sense of belonging. He was part of the machine, a trusted cog in the great engine of national defense. The jokes flew, the stories of weekend passes were exchanged, and for a glorious fleeting moment, everything was exactly as it should be. He was blissfully unaware of the other, quieter rhythms that pulsed beneath the surface of the base, the secrets that were kept not in the open hangars, bathed in fluorescent light, but in the ones tucked away, their doors sealed, their windows dark, guarding truths that would one day shatter his world. The days at Wright Patterson began to bleed into one another, not with monotony, but with the satisfying cadence of a well-rehearsed symphony. For John, the world narrowed to the gleaming skins of aircraft and the intricate clockwork of their internal systems. His life found its tempo in the pre-dawn muster, the scent of coffee and jet fuel mingling in the cool morning air, and the first metallic screech of a hangar door rolling open to greet the day. His hands, no longer those of a novice, learned the intimate language of the machines. The C-130 Hercules demanded a different kind of respect than the F-16 Falcon. The Hercules was a workhorse, a muscular, dependable giant whose 4 powerful engines and cavernous belly spoke of endurance and heavy lifting. His inspections of its massive frame were methodical, a careful walk around checking for stress fractures on the wings, ensuring the integrity of the landing gear, and testing the complex hydraulics of the rear ramp. It was solid, predictable work. The F-16s were a different breed entirely. They were thoroughbreds, all sleek lines and nervous energy. Working on one felt like tuning a musical instrument built for a supersonic concerto. The cockpit was a snug universe of dials and switches, and the engine, a Pratt & Whitney turbofan, was a masterpiece of contained violence. He would spend hours with Davies, tracing fuel lines and checking the flight control systems, their movements a silent, coordinated dance of wrenches and diagnostic tools. A single misplaced wire in the avionics bay could spell catastrophe at Mach 2, and that ever-present weight of responsibility forged a deep, unspoken bond among the team. The rhythm of the work was punctuated by the rhythm of their camaraderie. Kowalski's booming laugh would echo through the hangar after a particularly clever prank involving a misplaced tool. Rodriguez would share photographs of his newborn daughter during lunch breaks, his usual stoicism melting into quiet pride. They were a unit bound by grease-stained coveralls and a shared understanding of the immense trust placed in them. They navigated the daily challenges a stubborn bolt, a faulty sensor, a tight deadline for a critical repair with a collective grit and a stream of good-natured grumbling. It was within this comforting pattern that the first discordant notes began to sound. His eyes, growing accustomed to the base's normal flow, started to pick up on the anomalies. Certain hangars, set apart from the main cluster and surrounded by an extra layer of fencing, never had their doors open. No roar of engines ever emanated from them. No teams of mechanics congregated outside. Personnel, entering or exiting those areas, moved with a brisk, purposeful gait that seemed devoid of the usual casual banter. They were often accompanied by men in crisp, unmarked uniforms, their faces neutral and their eyes constantly scanning. John mentioned it once to Davies, a casual observation about the quiet corner of the base. Davies had just shrugged, his focus on a torque wrench, offering a non-committal grunt before changing the subject to the weekend's baseball game. The dismissal was subtle, but it was enough. A seed of mild, idle curiosity was planted in John's mind, a quiet question mark hovering over those silent, secretive buildings that operated on a rhythm all their own. The familiar rhythm of the hangar fractured on a Tuesday. The air, usually thick with the sounds of ratchets and casual conversation, grew still and watchful. Sergeant Miller moved through the workspace with a different kind of energy, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a taut, focused silence. His eyes scanned the mechanics until they landed on John, and with a curt jerk of his head, he summoned him to the relative privacy of the tool crib. The other men subtly averted their gazes, their postures stiffening as John passed, the easy camaraderie of moments before evaporating into a charged stillness. Inside the cramped confines of the crib, surrounded by the metallic scent of oil and neatly hung wrenches, Sergeant Miller's voice was a low, urgent thing. He bypassed all pleasantries, his gaze locked on John's. The assignment was simple, he explained. A special detail requiring a small, discreet team. Their task was to transfer a shipment of crates from a newly arrived, unmarked C5 Galaxy to a specific, secured location. The name of the location made the fine hairs on John's arm stand up. Hangar 18. The sergeant emphasized the words, discreet and efficient, his tone leaving no room for questions. This was not a request. It was an order wrapped in an unspoken warning. An hour later, John found himself standing in the shadow of the massive C5, its sheer size momentarily dwarfing the unease coiling in his gut. The crates were unlike any he had handled before. Constructed from a dull, non-reflective metal, they were completely unmarked, devoid of the stenciled labels and handling instructions that adorned every other piece of military hardware. They were sealed with heavy-duty latches that looked more like industrial locks, and their edges were reinforced with thick, welded steel bands. When he and two other silent airmen leaned into the first one, the weight was astonishing, far denser than any aircraft, part, or munitions box he had ever moved. It felt less like moving equipment and more like shifting a solid block of lead, the contents hidden away with an absolute finality. They loaded the crates onto a flatbed truck, the only sounds the grunts of effort and the hollow clang of metal on metal. The drive across the base was conducted in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The usual bustle of the tarmac seemed to fade away as they approached the restricted sector, the air growing heavier, as if charged with static. The perimeter of Hangar 18 was demarcated by a double layer of fencing topped with coiled razor wire, and the guards stationed at the gate were not the familiar faces of the base security police. These men wore black fatigues without insignia, and their expressions were as blank and impenetrable as the crates they were there to receive. They moved with a cold, robotic efficiency, scanning badges and waving the truck through without a word. As the heavy main door of the hangar began to slide open, revealing only a sliver of profound darkness within, a cold dread settled deep in John's bones. This was not the proud, open work of national defense he had signed up for. This was something else entirely, something that thrived in silence and shadows, and he was now irrevocably a part of its machinery. The oppressive silence inside Hangar 18 was a physical presence, thick and cold, swallowing the sound of their footsteps and the low rumble of the truck's engine. The vast space was only partially illuminated, with pools of harsh white light falling from high overhead fixtures, leaving deep, unsettling shadows crouching between the support beams and along the distant walls. The air tasted different here, sterile and metallic, with an undercurrent of ozone that prickled the back of John's throat. It was a place that felt disconnected from the rest of the base, a vacuum where normal rules did not apply. As they maneuvered the first unmarked crate from the flatbed onto a waiting hydraulic lift, a sliver of light from above caught the metal surface at just the right angle. Etched near one of the heavy latches, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at it, was a series of markings. They were not stenciled or painted. They were carved into the metal itself with a fine, precise tool. The symbols were starkly angular, a collection of sharp lines and intersecting geometric shapes that formed no alphabet or language John had ever seen. They looked less like written communication and more like a schematic or a complex mathematical equation, their purpose utterly inscrutable. A cold finger of unease traced its way down his spine. This was not standard military inventory marking. Later, back in the main hangar, the familiar smells of grease and sweat did little to dispel the chill that had settled in his core. He found Sergeant Miller reviewing a maintenance log near a silent F-16. The question felt dangerous, a rock he was about to throw into a still pond. But his curiosity was a live wire. He approached cautiously, keeping his voice low. He mentioned the crates, the strange weight of them, and then, hesitantly, described the angular symbols. He asked if there was some kind of new, classified project designation. The change in Miller was instantaneous and terrifying. The sergeant's head snapped up. His eyes, usually just weary, now held a flat, hard glint of pure alarm. His jaw tightened and he took a sharp step forward, invading John's personal space, his presence suddenly immense and threatening. The words that followed were not an answer, but a weapon delivered in a low, venomous hiss that brooked no argument. He was told in no uncertain terms that he had seen nothing, that the crates, their contents, and anything etched upon them were not his concern, had never been his concern, and would never be his concern. He was ordered to erase the memory from his mind, to forget the symbols, to forget the hangar, to forget the entire assignment, as if it were a bad dream. Any further mention, to anyone, would be considered a severe breach of security protocol, with consequences he did not want to imagine. The rebuke was so harsh, so laced with genuine fear, that it stole the air from John's lungs. He could only nod, a stiff, jerky motion, as Miller stared him down for another, long, punishing moment before turning away. The warning echoed in the silence left behind, solidifying John's mild unease into a hard, cold knot of suspicion and fear. He was no longer just curious. He was afraid, and he now knew, with a dreadful certainty, that he had stumbled into a secret that was never meant to be found. The camaraderie that had once warmed the hangar floor turned to frost overnight. Where there had been backslaps and shared jokes, there were now averted eyes and carefully maintained distances. The incident with the crates and the sergeant's furious warning had cast a long, dark shadow over John's presence. His colleagues, men he had considered friends, treated him like a contaminated object. Conversations would falter as he approached, and the easy rhythm of their work now excluded him, leaving him to labor in a bubble of profound isolation. They all knew, on some unspoken level, that he had brushed up against something forbidden, and the instinct for self-preservation was stronger than any bond of friendship. He had become a ghost in his own life, moving through the familiar motions of maintenance and inspection, but utterly alone inside his own head. The nights offered no refuge. Sleep became a treacherous landscape where his waking fears blossomed into full-blown terrors. He would jolt awake in the pitch-black barracks, his heart hammering against his ribs, the echo of Sergeant Miller's hissed warning still ringing in his ears. His dreams were a chaotic montage of the unmarked crates, which would now pulse with a faint, internal light, and the angular symbols would writhe and rearrange themselves into monstrous, predatory shapes. He would dream of the heavy door of Hangar 18 sliding open not to darkness, but to a blinding, silent light from which elongated, shadowy figures emerged, moving toward him with an unnatural, gliding grace. He would wake drenched in a cold sweat, the sterile, metallic taste of that forbidden hangar still clinging to his senses, the line between nightmare and memory permanently blurred. His paranoia, once a quiet whisper, grew into a constant, humming static in the background of his thoughts. His eyes, now attuned to the base's hidden patterns, began to notice the subtle shifts in security. The patrols around the perimeter of Hangar 18 had doubled, the black-clad guards with their expressionless faces, a more frequent and ominous presence. He saw new cameras being installed on the high fences, their lenses like black, unblinking eyes. Unmarked vans came and went at odd hours, their arrivals and departures seeming to coincide with a palpable tightening of the atmosphere across the entire base. Every distant siren, every official-looking vehicle, every hushed conversation between senior officers felt like a thread connecting back to him, to his moment of forbidden curiosity. He started to question everything, even his own reflection in the polished surface of a jet's fuselage. Was he just a mechanic, a simple cog in a machine he understood, or had he become an unwilling participant in a conspiracy of unimaginable scale? The weight of his forced silence was crushing, compressing his world into a single terrifying question. What was so important, so world-shattering, that it required this fortress of secrecy and this absolute annihilation of a single man's peace? The summons came not as a barked order, but as a quiet, typewritten note left on his bunk. The assignment was for night watch, a solitary 12-hour shift guarding a remote checkpoint designated Echo 7. The location was a small, prefabricated shed positioned at the very edge of the tarmac's lights, its single window offering a direct, unimpeded view of the monolithic, silent form of Hangar 18 several hundred yards away. It was not a random posting. It felt like a test, or perhaps a punishment. A deliberate placement in the one spot on the entire base, designed to amplify every one of his burgeoning fears as the sun bled out behind the horizon, conjuring the world into a deep navy blue. John took his post. The day's heat fled, replaced by a chill that seeped through the thin walls of the shed and into his bones. The familiar daytime symphony of the base ceased entirely, leaving behind a vacuum of sound so absolute that the hum of the single fluorescent bulb overhead became a deafening roar. The only other noises were the occasional mournful cry of the wind whipping across the vast, empty concrete and the infrequent, distant crunch of a patrol vehicle's tires on gravel, a sound that would approach, pause, and then recede, leaving him more alone than before. Hangar 18 sat under the weak glow of its own perimeter lights, a brooding rectangular slab of darkness against the star-dusted sky. It was the silence that was most unnerving. A place of that size, on an active military base, should have had some sounder generator, a ventilation system, the murmur of a night crew. But it emitted nothing. It was a void. Then the lights began. Not the steady security beams, but something else. From within the deep shadows near the base of the massive main door, a faint greenish light would flicker. It was not the warm, erratic dance of a flame, but a cold digital stutter, blinking on and off in an irregular, nonsensical pattern. It would appear for a few seconds, vanish for a minute, then reappear in a different spot, a sickly will-o'-the-wisp dancing at the edge of his vision, daring him to look away. Near midnight, the crunch of tires signaled the arrival of a patrol jeep, which pulled to a stop just beyond his shed. Two of the black-clad guards from the hangar's inner perimeter got out, their figures silhouetted against the distant lights of the main base. They stood by their vehicle, unaware or unconcerned with his presence in the dark shed. The wind carried fragments of their conversation to him, their voices low and tense. "The protocols are failing," one muttered, the words sharp with a frustration that bordered on fear. "They're saying it's not a breach, not technically, just heightened activity. The dampeners can't keep up," the other replied, his voice lower, more cautious. A short, bitter laugh. "Activity. That's one word for it. I call it a countdown. If one of them gets past the inner ring, just don't. Keep your head down, do your shift, and pray you never have to see what's on the other side of that door for real." The words containment breaches and dampeners, and them hung in the cold air long after the jeep had driven away, its taillights shrinking into pinpricks. They were not talking about a malfunctioning generator or a misrouted shipment. The language was one of a prison, of things that were supposed to be hell but were struggling to get out. The flickering green lights now seemed less like a malfunction and more like a signal, or a symptom. The dread that had been a cold stone in his stomach now bloomed into a living, breathing thing, coiling around his lungs and constricting his throat. He was no longer just guarding a lonely post. He was a sentry on the edge of an abyss, listening to the whispers of what lay trapped within, and the anticipation of what might come crawling out was a torture more exquisite than any he had ever known. The silence shattered. One moment, the world was a frozen tableau of dread and whispered secrets. The next, it was a maelstrom of screaming steel. The alarm was not a single siren, but a chorus of them, a piercing, undulating wail that ripped through the fabric of the night, so loud it felt like a physical blow. The single, humming fluorescent light in the shed flickered violently, casting strobing, frantic shadows that danced like panicked ghosts. Across the base, banks of floodlights snapped on, their harsh white beams cutting through the darkness, transforming the quiet tarmac into a stage for sudden, chaotic motion. From his post, John's view of Hangar 18 became a focal point of the erupting bedlam. The perimeter fence was suddenly alive with the darting beams of flashlights, the silhouettes of the black-clad guards no longer patrolling with cool indifference, but running their movements sharp and urgent. A fleet of unmarked, armored vehicles screeched to a halt near the massive hangar door, disgorging more personnel who moved with a coordinated, aggressive speed. But it was the lights from within the hangar itself that stole the breath from his lungs. The previous night's faint, greenish flicker was gone, replaced by a violent, rhythmic pulsing. A deep, actinic blue light would flash, illuminating the entire structure from within for a split second, casting the silhouettes of the running men into stark, jerky relief, followed by a wave of brilliant, sickly magenta. The pulses were not random. They had a strange, syncopated rhythm, like a frantic alien heartbeat, and with each throb, a low, subsonic hum vibrated through the concrete floor and up into the soles of John's boots. Orders were screaming from his radio, a cacophony of coded phrases and frantic voices, but his training, his duty, his very sense of self-preservation evaporated under the onslaught of that terrible, pulsing light. The guards whispered conversation from the night before, containment breaches. Heightened activity echoed in his mind, no longer a vague threat, but a terrifying, unfolding reality. This was no drill. This was the event they had all feared. The reason for the secrecy, the unmarked crates, the harsh warnings. Every instinct told him to run, to flee into the relative safety of the base's chaos. But a deeper, more primal compulsion took hold, a need to see, to know, to finally look upon the truth that had haunted his every waking and sleeping moment. Against every order, against every shred of military discipline, screaming in his head, he found his body moving. He stepped out of the relative safety of the shed, the wailing sirens a soundtrack to his disobedience, and began to run, not away from the pulsing heart of the chaos, but directly toward the blinding, rhythmic storm erupting from Hangar 18. The world narrowed to a single, pulsing point of light and the frantic drumming of his own heart. John's sprint across the tarmac was a blur of adrenaline and terror, his boots slapping against the cold concrete in a rhythm that matched the chaotic beat of the sirens. The actinic flashes from the hangar painted the scene in stuttering nightmare tableaus men, frozen in mid-run, their faces masks of stark panic, the angular shadows of vehicles stretching and contorting like living things. The subsonic hum was a physical pressure now, a vibration that rattled his teeth and made the air itself feel thick and resistant, as if he were forcing his way through invisible water. He used the chaos as his cover, darting between parked fuel trucks and crouching behind stacks of cargo pallets, his movements fueled by a desperate, singular purpose. The massive sealed door of Hangar 18 was his destination, but as he drew closer, he saw it was not fully closed. In the frantic scramble, it had been left with a gap, a vertical sliver of darkness, no wider than a man's hand, wedged between the two colossal steel panels. It was an imperfection, a crack in the fortress wall, and it called to him. Flattening himself against the cold, riveted steel of the hangar's exterior, he pressed his eye to the narrow opening. The world outside, the sirens, the shouts, the sweeping lights vanished, replaced by the view into the heart of the secret. His mind, conditioned to expect the familiar shapes of aircraft wings, tails, cockpits, struggled to process what it was seeing. There, bathed in the source of the pulsating light, was a craft, but it was like no machine built by human hands. Its hull was a seamless, shimmering skin of a metallic substance that seemed to drink the light and then give it back, glowing with its own soft, internal luminescence. It was a perfect, silent teardrop shape, resting on the concrete floor without any visible landing gear. Its surface so impossibly smooth, it looked liquid. There were no rivets, no seams, no windows, only a continuous, organic curve that defied every principle of aeronautical engineering he knew. And then he saw the figures. They moved in the shifting, colored light around the base of the craft, their forms tall and impossibly slender, gliding more than walking. Their movements were a study in impossible grace, a fluid, boneless motion that made the frantic scrambling of the human personnel around them look clumsy and primitive. They were shadows given form, their long limbs articulating in ways that sent a primal jolt of revulsion and awe through his system. They were not wearing environmental suits or military gear. Their forms seemed to be their own, their silhouettes starkly non-human. One turned, its upper body rotating with a smooth, unhurried pivot, and for a heart-stopping second, John felt a wave of cold certainty wash over him. This was not a secret weapon. This was not a Soviet prototype. This was something from beyond any border on any map. The shock was so absolute, so fundamental that it froze him solid, his body locked in place, his eye glued to the crack, his mind screaming in a silent, endless denial of the impossible truth he was witnessing. The initial shock that had frozen him began to thaw, replaced by a hyper-focused, almost painful clarity. His mind, reeling from the sight of the impossible craft, now latched onto the details of the beings themselves, etching the terrifying truth into his memory with the permanence of a brand. They were tall, far taller than any man, their bodies composed of a slender, elongated grace that seemed to defy the very pull of gravity. Their limbs were long and thin, moving with a fluid, boneless articulation that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. They did not walk so much as glide, their feet seeming to barely make contact with the polished concrete floor. Their motions a silent, elegant ballet performed amidst the human chaos. It was their heads, however, that held his gaze with a terrifying magnetism. They were larger than a human head, and proportionally dominated their slender frames. And their eyes were vast, liquid pools of darkness, set deep within smooth, featureless faces that lacked any other discernible features. There were no noses, no mouths, no ears, just those immense obsidian orbs that seemed to absorb the pulsating light from their craft rather than reflect it. They did not blink. They simply observed, scanning their surroundings with a calm, unnerving intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. In their silent, watchful presence, John felt a profound sense of insignificance, like an insect being studied under a magnifying glass. His gaze, tearing away from the beings, swept across the cavernous interior of the hangar. The space was not the empty vault he had imagined. The walls were lined with banks of humming machinery that bore no resemblance to the clunky, wired consoles he worked with daily. These were sleek panels of the same shimmering metal as the craft, covered in glowing, three-dimensional symbols that floated in the air before them, the same angular, geometric language he had seen etched onto the crates. Wires of pure light, not copper, snaked across the floor, connecting the alien technology to hastily rigged human monitoring stations, where frantic technicians in biohazard suits stared at screens displaying cascading data. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the teardrop-shaped craft, a note of immense, contained power. In that single, crystallizing moment, decades of speculation, of fringe theories and government denials collapsed into a single, undeniable reality. This was not a secret military project. This was not a weapon. This was extraterrestrial. The craft, the beings, the technology. It was all from another world. And the purpose of Wright Patterson of Hangar 18, of the unmarked crates and the brutal secrecy, was not to build, but to hide. This base, this very hangar, was a vault, a prison, a laboratory built to contain and study the greatest secret in human history, to keep this earth-shattering truth locked away from the world. The weight of that realization was a physical blow, stealing his breath and hollowing out his chest. He was not just looking at aliens. He was looking at the reason for a global lie, and the knowledge settled upon him with the crushing force of a planet. The brutal grip on his arms was the first thing that tore him from the trance of revelation. Before he could even process the movement, he was wrenched backward. His eye ripped from the sliver of light, the alien tableau replaced by the enraged, contorted face of a black-clad god. The world snapped back into a roar of sound and violent motion. Hands, many of them, clamped down on him, yanking his arms behind his back with a professional, painful efficiency. A cold, hard click of handcuffs sealed around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. He was dragged, his boots scraping and stumbling across the concrete, away from the pulsating heart of Hangar 18. He did not struggle. The fight had been blasted out of him by the magnitude of what he had seen. He was a shell, his mind still orbiting that silent, teardrop craft and those vast, dark eyes. They did not take him to the base's standard brig. He was shoved into the back of a windowless van, its interior smelling of stale sweat and ozone. The ride was short and disorienting, ending in the bowels of a nondescript administrative building he had never entered. The room they threw him into was small, soundproofed, and brutally lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was cold and still. He was left alone. For what felt like an eternity, cuffed to a bolted-down metal chair, the events of the last few minutes replaying on a nightmarish loop in his head. The door finally opened, and two men in crisp, dark suits entered. They were not military. Their authority was quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. They did not introduce themselves. The interrogation was not a questioning. It was a dissection. One man remained by the door, a silent, imposing statue, while the other sat opposite John, his expression a mask of detached professionalism. He was forced to recount everything, from the moment the alarm sounded to the second he was apprehended. He described the crack in the door, the shimmering craft, the tall, slender figures. As he spoke, the man across the table took no notes, his eyes never leaving John's face, absorbing the confession with an unnerving calm. When John finished, the man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational, yet utterly menacing, tone. He laid out the consequences with chilling clarity. Court-martial for treason was the best-case scenario. The more likely outcome, he implied, was a quiet disappearance into a military prison from which he would never emerge, or a tragic, inexplicable accident. His family would be told nothing. His existence would be erased. The threat was not shouted. It was stated as a simple, incontrovertible fact, its weight crushing the last vestiges of John's resistance. Then came the most surreal part of the ordeal. The man produced a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. It was a typed statement, a dry, bureaucratic account of the evening's events. It described a scheduled base-wide security drill to test emergency response protocols. It stated that Airman John Mitchell had, in the confusion, strayed into a restricted area and observed classified military hardware, a new stealth drone prototype under development. His vivid descriptions were dismissed as the product of stress, disorientation, and the startling visual effects of the prototype's experimental anti-radar coating. He was ordered to read it, to memorize it, and to sign it. The truth he had just confessed was being systematically dismantled and repackaged as a mundane, explainable mistake. The craft, the beings, the humming technology, all of it was being folded into a bland official lie labeled drill. The angular symbols, the whispered fears, the pulsing lights, they were all being erased, not from the world but from his story, forcing him to become the primary agent of his own silencing. The sterile, windowless room became a factory for forgetting. After the interrogation, the men in suits were replaced by a procession of administrative personnel, their faces as blank as the walls. They carried with them not weapons, but paper-thick, daunting stacks of it, bound in heavy, dark blue folders. Each document was a confidentiality agreement, a non-disclosure form, an official Secrets Act affidavit, all layered with dense, impenetrable legal jargon designed to intimidate and obscure. They were placed before him one after another, a never-ending cascade of institutional authority. A pen was thrust into his still-trembling hand, its cold plastic feeling like a surgical instrument. Each signature was a surrender, a tiny act of self-betrayal scrawled on the dotted line. His name, signed again and again, was no longer his identity but a brand of compliance, a chain that would bind his tongue for decades. With every flourish of the pen, the vibrant, terrifying truth of what he had witnessed was buried deeper under the cold, dry weight of bureaucracy. By the time the last form was signed, his hand was cramping and his soul felt numb. The official story was then presented to him, not as a possibility, but as the new, unassailable reality. A senior officer he had never seen before entered the room and delivered a crisp, monotone briefing. The events of the previous night were officially and permanently classified as a large-scale, unannounced training exercise designed to evaluate base lockdown and security response under simulated duress. The pulsating lights were explained as experimental holographic projectors. The strange hum was attributed to a new type of ground-based radar system being tested. The prototype drone he had glimpsed was a cutting-edge, but entirely terrestrial aircraft. The story was a seamless, polished fiction, engineered to be just plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry and just classified enough to deter any deeper investigation. He was ordered to internalize this narrative, to repeat it verbatim if ever questioned, and to understand that any deviation would be met with the full, devastating force of the consequences he had already been promised. The transfer orders came within hours, a brutal and efficient severing of his old life. There was no time for goodbyes, no chance to explain his sudden disappearance to Rodriguez, Davies, or Kowalski. He was given 30 minutes to pack his personal effects from the barracks under the watchful eye of an armed guard. The familiar surroundings, the footlocker, the neatly made bed, the photograph of his parents on the small shelf felt like artifacts from a life belonging to someone else. He was then driven to the flight line and put on a cargo plane headed for a remote, desolate base in Alaska, a place of ice and isolation so far from the heart of things that it might as well have been another planet. As the plane lifted off, climbing above the Ohio landscape that had once held so much promise, he watched Wright Patterson shrink into a meaningless grid of lights below. He wasn't just being relocated, he was being erased. His curiosity punished by exile, his ties to friendship and camaraderie surgically cut, leaving him alone with a truth he could never share and a story he was forced to deny. The years that followed his discharge from the Air Force were a study in quiet erosion. John settled into a small, unremarkable town in the Pacific Northwest, where the constant drizzle and gray skies felt like an external manifestation of his internal state. He found work as a mechanic in a local garage, his skilled hands now tending to the mundane ailments of sedans and pickup trucks instead of warbirds. The work was simple, predictable, and blessedly free of secrets. He performed his duties with a quiet competence that earned him the respect of his boss and the vague, unspoken pity of his coworkers. They saw a quiet man, a loner who never spoke of his past, who always took his lunch alone in the corner of the break room, staring out at the rain-slicked parking lot with eyes that held a distance they could never bridge. He tried to build a life. He rented a small house on the edge of town, its rooms sparsely furnished and perpetually silent. He dated a kind woman named Sarah for a time, a librarian with a soft voice and a gentle smile, who tried to coax him out of his shell. But his shell was not a mood. It was a fortress built from the bricks of a truth he could never share. He would flinch at sudden noises, his gaze becoming distant and haunted during quiet moments. When a television show or a casual conversation turned to topics of space exploration or government conspiracies, a cold wall would slam down behind his eyes, and he would find an excuse to leave the room. Sarah's patience eventually wore thin against the impenetrable barrier of his secrecy. She told him with tears in her eyes that she felt she was living with a ghost, that he was a man whose heart and history were locked in a room to which she had no key. Her departure left a fresh ache, but it was a familiar one. The pain of confirmation that the trauma of Hangar 18 had rendered him unfit for the normal connections other people took for granted. The memories were his constant, unwelcome companions. They did not come as full-blown flashbacks, but as insidious fragments. The smell of a certain industrial cleaner would transport him back to the sterile metallic air inside the forbidden hangar. The sight of complex angular patterns in a child's puzzle or the steel framework of a new building would make his heart stutter, the ghost of those etched symbols searing his mind's eye. The worst were the nights. He would lie awake, the silence of his own home pressing in on him, and his mind would conjure the exact sensation of the subsonic hum vibrating through his boots, the precise, unnatural grace of a slender, gliding limb, the bottomless black pools of those vast, observing eyes. He had signed away his right to speak, but he could not sign away the truth branded onto his neurons. His life after the Air Force was not a new beginning. It was a long, slow exile, a performance of normalcy played out on a stage he had long since left, haunted by the specter of a single, silent hangar under an Ohio sky. The television's blue glow was the only light in the room, a pulsating square in the twilight of John's small, silent house. He sat in his worn armchair, a half-forgotten dinner cooling on the tray beside him, his body held in the familiar, weary slump that had become his default posture. The nightly news was a drone of political scandals and weather reports, a white noise backdrop to his isolation. Then the anchor's tone shifted, becoming crisper, more portentous. The screen filled with a stark black and white photograph of a government building, overlaid with bold red text. Declassified, the Pentagon releases UFO files. The word was a physical blow, a jolt of electricity straight to his core. For 36 years he had meticulously built walls against that term, treating it like a psychic landmine. He would change the channel, leave the room, close the book. But now it was being broadcast into the sanctum of his living room by a prim, respectable news anchor, discussed with a casual, almost bored authority. The report detailed the release of previously classified documents, official admissions of unidentified aerial phenomena, witnessed by military pilots, grainy videos of tic-tac-shaped objects performing impossible maneuvers against the laws of physics. A former intelligence official appeared on screen, speaking calmly about non-human biologics and exotic material. The careful, fragile dam John had constructed inside his mind shattered. The professional, sanitized language of the report could not contain the visceral flood of memory that broke through. The sterile, metallic taste of the air in Hangar 18 filled his mouth. The subsonic hum vibrated up from the floorboards and into his bones. The pulsating, actinic blue and magenta light strobed behind his eyes, and in its flash, he saw them again, the tall, slender forms gliding with that impossible grace, the vast, obsidian eyes that held a cold, ancient intelligence. It wasn't a grainy video or a declassified document. It was a living, breathing memory, raw and screaming. A hot, furious pressure built behind his eyes. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a righteous, burning anger. For decades, he had carried this burden alone, his sanity questioned by his own silence, his relationships fractured by the unspoken horror. He had been made a coward in his own story, a man who flinched at shadows, all to protect a lie. And for what? So that men in suits could sit in television studios and drip-feed a sanitized version of the truth decades later, treating the greatest revelation in human history as a matter of bureaucratic declassification. They had stolen his peace, his future, his very identity, and now they were casually admitting to the public that, well, perhaps there might be something to it all. He stood up, his body trembling not with fear, but with a long-suppressed resolve. The anger crystallized into a single clear purpose. It was no longer enough to just survive the secret. The need for closure, for a reckoning, for some small measure of justice for the life that had been taken from him, became an undeniable force. He walked to his desk, the same one where he had once nervously contemplated the recorder. This time, his hand was steady. He opened the drawer and took out the small digital device, its red eye dormant. He placed it on the polished wood, its presence now not an object of dread, but a tool of liberation. The world was finally, clumsily, stumbling toward the truth. It was time he met it halfway. It was time to give the grainy videos and the official jargon a name, a face, and a cost. The trigger had been pulled, and after a lifetime of silence, John was finally ready to speak. The small red light on the recorder glowed, a tiny beacon in the quiet gloom of the study, bearing witness to the end of a 36-year silence. John leaned forward, his voice, once choked with fear, now low and steady, stripped raw by a resolve that had finally hardened into fact. He was no longer just a haunted man confessing a secret, chronicler delivering a history that had been deliberately erased. He began, not with the chaos of the alarm or the terror of his discovery, but with the cold, calculated architecture of the secret itself. Hangar 18. He described the craft again, but this time with the analytical eye of a mechanic who had spent a lifetime turning the memory over in his mind. The teardrop shape was not merely aerodynamic, it was a perfect, seamless form, a single, unbroken piece of a metallic alloy that seemed to be both solid and fluid, its surface cool to the touch, yet humming with a latent energy he could feel in his teeth. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no panels for maintenance. It was a single engineered organism, resting silently on the floor as if the concrete beneath it were irrelevant, its very presence defying gravity and human understanding. The pulsating lights he had seen were not external projections, but a visible manifestation of its power core, a heart of alien energy beating within that impossibly smooth hull. And then he spoke of its purpose. Hangar 18, he explained, was not a storage facility. It was a laboratory, a cradle of reverse engineering on a scale the public could not fathom. The unmarked crates he had moved contained not just alien artifacts, but salvaged components, crystalline circuitry, wires of solidified light, fragments of the hull material that teams of scientists and engineers were desperately trying to decode. The entire operation was a global endeavor, a clandestine pact between governments that saw not wonder in the discovery, but an unprecedented key to power. They weren't trying to understand the universe. They were trying to weaponize it, to harness propulsion systems that could cross galaxies and energy sources that could render fossil fuels obsolete, ensuring a stranglehold on global dominance for the nation that cracked the code first. He detailed the beings not as monsters from a nightmare, but as the other prisoners in that sterile vault. They were studied, he believed, like specimens in a zoo, their biology, their technology, their very consciousness poked and prodded by men in biohazard suits. The whispers of containment breaches were not about equipment failure, but about the subjects themselves, their heightened activity, a silent, desperate struggle against their captors. The governments of the world had colluded to bury this truth, not out of fear of panic, but out of a voracious hunger for the ultimate technological advantage. The secrecy, the threats, the ruined lives like his own, were all just the necessary cost of doing business in the new hidden arms race that began not between nations, but between humanity and the stars, a race the public was funding with their taxes and their ignorance, never knowing the prize was a power that could reshape the world or shatter it forever. The silence that followed his initial revelations was not empty, but thick with the gravity of the unspoken. John's gaze was fixed on a point far beyond the walls of his study, seeing not the clutter of his present life, but the sterile, sprawling architecture of the lie he had served. He began to elaborate, his voice a low, relentless river carving through the bedrock of decades of official denial. The cover-up, he explained, was not a single act of concealment, but a living, breathing organism with a global nervous system. It was not merely the work of a few rogue generals at Wright, Patterson. It was a deeply entrenched international compact, a silent covenant between powers that had agreed, in the chilling aftermath of recovery, that some truths were too disruptive for the human psyche to bear. The secrecy was a quarantine, not just on technology, but on an idea. The idea that humanity was not the pinnacle of creation, but a middling species in a cosmos, teeming with intelligences, that rendered our history, our wars, our very gods, provincial and small. He detailed the sheer, staggering scale of the operation. Hangar 18 was just one node. The most famous, but there were others, scattered across remote deserts and deep beneath mountain ranges, all part of a clandestine network dedicated to the disassembly of the impossible. The reason for such extreme measures, he insisted, was not born from a paternalistic desire to protect the public, but from a cold, pragmatic calculus. The immediate release of the truth would not have caused mere panic. It would have triggered a systemic collapse. Every foundational pillar of human society governance, religion, economics, science, was built upon the assumption of human primacy, to reveal that we were not only not alone, but that we were holding other beings captive, dissecting their ships and their bodies, would have shattered that foundation into dust. The global order would have dissolved into a chaos of existential dread and religious fervor, a bedlam that would have made every war in history look like a minor squabble. Silence, therefore, was not a choice, but a perceived necessity for the survival of civilization, as we knew it. Then, his tone shifted, becoming more speculative, haunted by a theory that had crystallized over his long years of solitude. The official line, the one he was forced to parrot, was that the craft had crashed. But what if it hadn't? The craft he saw was pristine, flawless, a thing of perfect, silent engineering. There was no wreckage, no scarring, no evidence of a violent impact. His voice dropped to a near whisper as he ventured his deepest fear. What if the beings inside were not explorers or ambassadors? What if they were prisoners or specimens collected from some distant corner of the galaxy and transported here to our planet only for their vessel to be intercepted or to malfunction? The hangar, then, was not a laboratory. It was a zoo, a penitentiary for interlopers from the stars. The containment breaches were not malfunctions, but escape attempts. The thought was more terrifying than any weapon. It meant that humanity's first contact was not a meeting of peers, but an act of cosmic incarceration. We were not the discoverers, we were the jailers. And in that row we had fundamentally challenged our own place in the cosmos, trading potential enlightenment for the grim, paranoid duty of guarding a cage, forever looking out at the stars, not with wonder, but with the fearful eyes of a warden, waiting for the rightful owners to come and demand an accounting for what we had stolen and caged. The final words hung in the air of the study, no longer just sounds but solid things, artifacts of a lifetime's burden finally laid down. John leaned back, the tension that had held his spine rigid for 36 years dissolving into a profound, weary stillness. The small red light on the recorder blinked off, its vigil ended. The silence that returned was different now, not the heavy, accusatory silence of his past, but a quiet, spacious emptiness, like a room after a long-awaited guest has finally departed. He had carried the secret not as a badge of honor, but as a shard of shrapnel lodged near his heart. A constant, low-grade poison that had seeped into every corner of his life. The weight of it had shaped his posture, haunted his dreams, and colored every relationship with the ghost of an unspoken truth. Now, with the telling complete, he felt the ghost had been given a voice, and in doing so had been released. The relief was not a joyous feeling, but a deep cellular unclenching. The first full breath drawn after a lifetime of holding it in. He looked down at his hands, resting on the worn wood of the desk. They were the same hands that had once tightened bolts on an F-16, that had trembled while signing the forms that stole his voice, that had fumbled through a life built on the foundation of a lie. Now, they were still. He hoped, with a fervor that was almost a prayer, that his testimony would be more than just the ravings of a disgruntled old man. He hoped it would be a spark. A spark for the journalists who chased shadows, for the scientists who dared to question the boundaries of known physics, for the ordinary people who looked at the night sky and felt a tug of curiosity they could not explain. He hoped his words would arm them with a fragment of truth, a piece of the puzzle that could help others find the courage to pull on the loose threads of official stories, to demand answers and to never accept a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. His own search was over, but he prayed it would mark the beginning of countless others. The cost of that hidden knowledge, however, remained, a permanent scar on his soul. The truth had not set him entirely free. It had simply exchanged one prison for another. He had traded the prison of silence for the prison of memory, of knowing. He had lost the simple patriotic faith of his youth, the easy camaraderie of his friends, the possibility of a normal love, the uncomplicated peace of a mind untroubled by the cosmic. The knowledge of what lay inside Hangar 18 had cost him his place in the world of men, rendering him a permanent outsider looking in. The burden of secrecy was gone, but the weight of the truth itself remained, the awesome, terrifying understanding that the universe was vaster, stranger, and far more mysterious than humanity was prepared to admit, and that we, in our fear, had chosen to hide in the shadows rather than step into its daunting light. The recording was finished, but the echo of its revelation would linger, a poignant, permanent note on the immense and terrible price of knowing what lies in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light.